is Mary Dombrowski, and this is War and Magic. I'm speaking to you from outside the main gate of what was, during World War II, Top Secret Station S. It was here and at other similar stations up and down the west coast of the United States that intelligence experts gathered information dubbed magic, which they then forwarded directly on to Washington, D.C. to the desk of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On the base of that information, Roosevelt made many difficult decisions, one of which remains controversial to this day, the issuance of Executive Order 9066, by which Japanese Americans were relocated from the coast of Washington and other states to the interior of the United States. This begins our first of 3 conversations with Seattle author Keith Robar. Mr. Robar, the author of Intelligence, Internment and Relocation, will discuss the difficult subject of the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066 and the subsequent handling of the relocation of Americans of Japanese ancestry away from the coast. In 1939, the Army's Signal Intelligence organized a special team of cryptanalysts to break the code, which Tokyo felt was absolutely unbreakable. The 97 Shiki Obun Onjiki, William F. Friedman, arguably the world's greatest cryptanalyst, headed the team. After 18 months of exhausting mental labor, the team created an analog machine which deciphered Japanese radio messages. Naval intelligence dubbed this and other breakthroughs magic, for they felt that such a bonanza could only have been created by magicians. Regarding magic intelligence, a joint congressional committee investigating the attack on Pearl Harbor stated, "The success achieved in reading the Japanese diplomatic codes merits the highest commendation, and all witnesses familiar with magic throughout the war have testified that it contributed enormously to the defeat of the enemy, greatly shortened the war, and saved many thousands of lives."
Hello, I'm Carolyn Goad, and I'm extremely pleased to be here on Bainbridge Island with Mr. Keith Robar, the author of Intelligence, Internment and Relocation. This will be the first of 3 interviews with him. Mr. Robar, the American public knows very little today about the magic intelligence, and during World War II, magic was absolutely top secret. How many individuals in President Roosevelt's administration were actually authorized to read the magic cables?
There were only 10. They felt that the best way to preserve the integrity of this top secret information was to limit the distribution. Some of the people that are quoted very often by the Japanese American, Hoover for one, were not privy to the magic messages. And as a consequence, their opinion is really irrelevant. They're entitled to their opinion, but if it's of no value, why bother?
So FBI Director Hoover was opposed to the evacuation of the ethnic Japanese.
Hoover did make one concession, however. His recommendation was that we lock up 10,000 Japanese and keep the rest under surveillance. And very uncharacteristic of Hoover, he asked his West Coast people their opinion. San Francisco, dismissive. Los Angeles, they were for evacuation, which brings up Executive Order 9066. This is the one that the Japanese claim was a violation of their civil rights.
How has the U.S. Supreme Court voted on Executive Order 9066? Is it currently constitutional?
Actually, 9066 was upheld by 3 decisions of the Supreme Court, the supreme law of the land. It's not up to the Japanese to determine what is constitutional and what is not. We pay the members of the court to do that for us. And frankly, I am more inclined to agree with a court than I am to a people who have an agenda. It's an evacuation order only. It doesn't specify any particular person, and unlike some books, it is not an internment order. They were simply asked to evacuate the West Coast. Now, the commission, Congressional Commission, who spent a couple of years studying this, said that there was no military necessity for the evacuation order.
Can you give us details on the military necessity of the evacuation order?
First, no one, and that includes the U.S. Navy, knew where Fleet Admiral Choichi Nagumo was. He was dominant on the Pacific, but the Pacific is a big place, and he was out there somewhere. He could have been right off the California coast, as far as we know. So that was one factor in the military necessity. Secondly, the unfortunate publicity coming out of World War II meant that the Americans were very suspicious of our Japanese residents. As a consequence, they suffered an economic collapse. They couldn't get jobs and so forth. They even froze their bank accounts. Now, I should elaborate on that a little bit. One of the major books from the Japanese viewpoint was Michi Wegland, who brought that up. Their bank accounts were frozen. But I have a document from the archives that says that money was being funneled to Japan by way of the Buddhist churches, and it was being sent by way of the Yokohama Specie Bank. This was to finance Japan's war against our ally, China. Of course, this was against the law. Thirdly, there was an undetermined, that's not the right English, is it? And we were not able to determine who was loyal and who was not loyal. We knew there were many loyal, but how many? Variable. So we were fighting for our lives here.
When you speak of the unfortunate news coming out of the war, I've heard that the ethnic Japanese were victims of violent attacks. Is that true?
There was a lot of violence against our Japanese residents. When the Japanese took the Philippines, they massacred the American troops and so forth, and especially the Filipinos. When word got back, the Filipinos were outraged, and they wanted to take it out on somebody, and the only one there was American Japanese. They had nothing to do with it. But when people are out of their mind with rage, they might do things that they would never do if they were possessed of all their faculties.
How can we, as Americans today, view Executive Order 9066?
So, Executive Order 9066, it was a terrible thing we did. Shameful, but it was necessary. It was absolutely necessary. And, as Eleanor Roosevelt said, Americans can be proud of the way we handled this very sensitive, very delicate situation. We did what we had to do, and as Roosevelt said, be as careful as you can, and we did. Although the Japanese still insist that their civil rights were violated. But we can criticize the Japanese. When I say Japanese, I mean Japanese Americans.
What do you mean we can criticize the Japanese Americans?
There were 2 deaths in the relocation centers, one at Manzanar and one at Poston, where Issei, that is the first generation Japanese, expressed their, expressed their thanks for living in the United States. The United States had been good to these people. They expressed it too loudly and too often. And one at Manzanar was caught one night going back to his room. They slashed his throat. The one at Poston, same thing. He was an Issei, elderly man, also very grateful to what America had done for him. Should have kept his mouth shut. They stabbed him in the throat. That's a hell of a way to die. Just because you're loyal to your adopted country?
Can you explain by what authority President Roosevelt ordered the internment?
We'll start in the year 1217 at Runnymede, when the British barons rammed the Magna Carta down King John's throat. Now, they were foolish, but they weren't stupid. They reserved to the king the right to make war. So, American legal system is based on English common law. We've made changes, substitutions, additions. The Brits wouldn't even recognize it now. But we get our presidential war powers from Title 50, Section 21. No, Section 21 of the Code. And this says that foreign nationals, when war is declared, automatically become enemy aliens. They are then subject to arrest, confiscation of property, internment, pending deportation. Okay, you cannot say, as the Japanese invariably do, that 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned. I was born in California, so I'm an American citizen. Where in the world are they going to deport me? And who would want me? So, you have to be precise in your use of language. This is not semantic quibbling. We have a legal term, and if you're going to use it correctly. Internment is for foreign aliens.
How many Japanese Americans were subject to the internment?
Only the Issei were subject to internment. There were 40,000, almost 41,000 Issei living on the West Coast. Of that number, a little over 16,000, under 17, but 16,800 and something were interned, less than half. It would suggest to people, thinking people, that the government operated with restraint and humanity. They were given hearings. If they were a threat to the war effort, they were interned, and that's where they belong. The others, some of them were considered dangerous, but not terribly dangerous. As a consequence, they were sent to relocation centers. They were confined there, but it was not like an internment camp. That was a jail. So, we had people that were aliens. They were exonerated, completely free. There were no threat. Some were possibly a threat when they had to be kept under surveillance. Others were downright dangers. We locked them up.
What do we know about the Japanese espionage on the West Coast in the late 1930s and early 1940s?
The Tokyo Syndicate ran from South America up to Alaska and heaven only knows where else. They were into drugs, prostitution, money laundering, and especially espionage. Now we have an interesting situation here. The Japanese point out there were no cases where spies were tried. People would interpret that to mean there were no spies. Actually, you don't put a spy on trial. First of all, he'll be replaced. And you go through that long rigmarole of trying to identify him. The trial, the defense attorney will ask you, how do you know this guy is a spy? Okay. They have to reveal their sources. So you blow your cover. Magic is no longer a secret. They changed their code. Could cost us the war. So they didn't do it.
Can you give us a specific example of the operations of the Tokyo Syndicate?
The report says this is the Office of Naval Investigation, that Tokyo Club had 200 hotels in Seattle. Well, that's just about all of them. And these are houses of prostitution. And they said one was high class. Now that sounds like an oxymoron to me. How do you get class in a prostitution house, a house of prostitution? Anyway, I think they probably mean it was a higher price. And they catered to military personnel. The idea being that if an officer was caught in a compromising position, he would be quite apt to save his marriage to tell some secrets.
The magic cables, where did they come from?
The Japanese Foreign Ministry communicated with their worldwide network of consulates and embassies by what we term magic. What they term is, don't know what they call it. I remember when our intelligence expert after the war was invited to Japan to this seems to be a characteristic of combatants. After the war, they meet and talk about, Anyway, Lohman brought that up, that they had broken the 97 Shiki Oban and Jiki machine. The Japanese wouldn't believe it. They said, no, they implied that we didn't have the intelligence to do that. And it was an extraordinary feat. I told you it took them 18 months. Well, they thought they had been betrayed. So this is their means of communicating. And there were a couple of situations in which cables were sent saying, we think the Americans are reading your cables. Well, they came to the conclusion that it was more likely some of the minor codes. There were about 18 different codes that the Japanese used. This Foreign Ministry code was the highest level. We had broken all of them except one, the naval code. But it was so complicated, even the Japanese didn't use it. So essentially, we were reading everything.
What about the cables themselves?
As to the cables themselves, one of them, which is probably one of the most significant, is the Nakauchi cable that was transmitted in May 1941. Nakauchi points out that he has Japanese Americans in defense plants. He has them in the army. And Roosevelt, he almost swallowed his cigarette holder and all when he read this. He immediately issued orders to seal the border, Canada and Mexico, because they were using necktie linings. They put the secrets in there. They were using bars of soap, hollows in shoes, everything. And there'd be submarines off the coast of Mexico, and boats, small boats would row out. They were transmitting the secrets that way.
Mr. Robar, then, based on magic intelligence, President Roosevelt took action by ordering the internment of alien nationals and by issuing Executive Order 9066.
The Nakauchi report is with dynamite, but Roosevelt takes an oath. Well, I guess most high-ranking officials take an oath to protect us from all enemies, both foreign and domestic. We would have impeached him if he had not taken action.
Do you have a spy report that is of local significance to Bainbridge Island?
The I-26 submarine was anchored off, not anchored, it was patrolling off Straits of Juan de Fuca, guarding the entrance. Now, we had three carriers, the Hornet, Saratoga, Lexington, Enterprise. That's what Yamamoto wanted. But one of Sato was the consul general in the Seattle office, and he was transmitting espionage report that came from the island. Now, it could have been Germans, a lot of Germans working in Bainbridge shipyard, except for the fact that these cables stopped when the Japanese were evacuated from the island.
Keith, can you give us an overview of the Imperial Japanese espionage in the U.S., including perhaps the use of German nationals?
The Japanese Foreign Office had 12 items of information that they needed desperately. Each consulate, their embassy was back in Washington, D.C., they're out of it. But the consulates in Seattle, Portland, so forth, they were given specific assignments. San Francisco now said they want San Francisco to give them information on paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, and 12. Now this would be war production, things like that. So I can't give you the specific information that item number 1 refers to. Now Los Angeles, they were to do 1, 2, 8, and 9. Each consulate had a specific assignment, the type of information that was required. When it got close to December 7th, the emphasis was on ship movement. They wanted to know the position of every ship on the Pacific so they could chart a course to evade them, to sneak up on us without being known. So the consulates and their spies were able to meet the challenge. Sometimes it was incredible when they give you production reports from Lockheed and Douglas. How many aircraft and what type? How do they get it? I worked at Boeing Plant 2, and one of the cables said that Boeing Plant 2 was doing some remodel work. I didn't know that, and I worked there. And not only that, I worked 2 shifts, and that is not at the same time. So as a consequence, I saw everyone coming in and going out over a period of time. There were no Japanese. There might have been Germans. We had a lot of Germans there. Don't know. There was also a cable that said that there was a new hangar going up at Sandpoint. Now that means nothing because you can drive by the highway and see the thing going up. But as General Eamon said, the Japanese had an enormous, that was his word, enormous spy system. America, I don't know, we're so smart in some ways and so dumb in others. It was so easy to penetrate with spies. The main reason is you wouldn't recognize a spy if you saw him. An American, any Caucasian in Japan would stand out like a sore thumb. Not only are they suspicious of strangers, strangers stand out. Over here, I doubt if there's a single ethnic group in the entire world that isn't represented in the United States. So we wouldn't recognize them.
Thank you for being with us, Mr. Robar. It's been extremely informative, and we'll be looking forward to talking to you again soon. Again, thanks for your time. And thank you for tuning in. Look for your local listings for the next installment of War and Magic. I'm Carolyn Goad on Bainbridge Island.